A very good morning and welcome to the Print Soft Cover. I am Shubhangi Mishra, and today we are digitally launching the new book, which is a memoir of a modern slavery activist called Awakening the Advocate. And today I'm interviewing the author, Matthew Friedman. Matthew is an American human rights activist with expertise in human trafficking and modern slavery. Matthew has done extensive work on human rights in South Asia, along with United Nations and USAID. Currently, he is the CEO of Hong Kong-based Mekong Club, which mobilizes the private sector to help fight modern slavery. Welcome to the print, Mr. Friedman. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm thrilled to be here today.
So the first thing that I actually want to ask you, which is a little bit outside the purview of the book, but it is about the defunding of USAID by President Donald Trump. I want to ask you how that is going to affect relief work in Asia, Africa, other, third world affected countries, especially when it comes to human trafficking.
So what you have is an agency that had a budget of around 40 billion US dollars a year, based in every continent, in hundreds of locations. And all of a sudden, the Trump administration made a decision that they felt like this was a redundant organization, it wasn't needed, and they shut it down. Now, technically, they couldn't do it this legally the way they did it. So there's a lot of court cases that are being filed to see whether or not USAID can be restated. The implications of not having USAID are catastrophic. You have health departments that need the money. You have girls' education. You have disaster response. You have poverty alleviation. All of these programs are ongoing. And then the switch was turned, and all of a sudden they're not going. So there's tremendous pressure from all over the world to get the United States government to continue doing this. I worked for the agency for 17 years. They do amazing work. We work very closely with governments, government of India. We work very closely with them. We have a very collaborative relationship, a comprehensive, cohesive relationship that allows for all types of things to happen. So I really personally, in my heart of hearts, think that it's going to come back. It's just devastating that we had to go through this trauma.
Right. So now we'll come back to the book, and I like how, even though it's a memoir, you shift the lens to trafficking survivors. And you've mentioned it through your years in Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Pakistan, and it offers a first-hand account of the personal narratives of survivors. Did you extensively document these interviews, or did you maintain a diary through your years of activism? Just take us through the process of, regurgitating all these notes that you've had over the years.
So for years, I was working as a public health officer in Nepal. And as part of my portfolio, I had the HIV/AIDS portfolio. And we were finding girls 12, 13 years old. We couldn't understand what was going on. This is a very conservative culture. So when we went to go and interview the girls, we heard the stories about how they were tricked and deceived and eventually sent off to India, often to Mumbai and Delhi and Kolkata. And when they were there, they were forced into prostitution. So I was hearing these stories over and over again, but I didn't really understand the evil of it until I actually went to some of these locations. I went to these brothels at the invitation of the Indian government as a public health person. I had a police officer. I went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this Caucasian guy, saw an opportunity, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me and said, "Save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me." I turned to the police officer and said, "We need to get her out of here." He said, "We can't do that." I said, "Why not? You're a police officer." And he said, "Well, if you try to leave, we'll both be hurt severely." So we left. We came back with more police, but of course she was gone. Now I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-old high school kids that said, when I grew up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be one. But every once in a while in life, we experience something that is so traumatic that we can't turn it off. And for those of us who become activists, we surrender to the fact that that's what we're going to do. So once I came to that point, I decided that I wanted to write a book. So as part of this book process, I would go to different shelters in India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal to collect these testimonials. And so I would go there, I would meet with the shelter staff, we would talk about what they were doing, and then there would be certain volunteers that would be brought forward. And so the volunteers would sit down and in their language with translation, they would give the stories, and then these were documented, and this is what you see in the book. And the reason why I did this is through storytelling, you get a much better sense of what human trafficking is. If I say the girl is this age and this is what happens to her, without describing the context, it's more difficult for people to understand.
Right. So, was Nepal the first South Asian country that you came to?
I had visited India and Pakistan and Bangladesh before I was posted in Nepal. I was actually, in my case of Nepal, I was supposed to only be there for a short time, for about 8 months, but I ended up staying 8 years because I just found the experience to be fascinating, and it really helped me to understand a lot about my professional self and my personal self. It was kind of an awakening in itself of, what happens outside of my my world in the United States that was so different. It felt like I was on a completely different planet, and it just kind of awakened me to parts of myself that I never would have known had I not had that experience.
And which year was this when you moved to Nepal?
1991.
And over these now more than 34, 35 years, do you think the situation of trafficking has improved at all? Do you think trafficking has reduced from Nepal to other parts of South Asia?
You can find success stories at the community levels and within countries where migration patterns change. But the number of people in what's called human trafficking and modern slavery is now up to 50 million people. In fact, there are more human trafficking victims today than any other time in history. Part of the reason why it went from 40 to 50 is COVID. So you had a lot of people that were in desperate circumstances. Let's say you had a Bangladeshi garment worker and she had a pretty good job. All of a sudden, COVID hits, the factory closes, not for days or weeks or months, but for years. She borrows money, can't pay it back, and then the traffickers kind of swoop in and take family members away and so forth. So what we're actually seeing is an increase. Now, the other thing that's important to understand is out of 50 million people, the documented number of people globally that were helped out of modern slavery was about 108,000. That's 0.2%, not even 0.5%. So if you ask the question, are we having success? The answer is no. And we're still seeing an increase in the number of people who are in human trafficking situations. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And part of the reason for writing books like this is to awaken people to the idea that this is a problem. It exists within their own country. But at the same time, there are things that you can do to help.
So systemically, we have been unable to make any dents. What are the major reasons for it?
I think a lot of it, the profits generated from modern slavery and human trafficking are 236 billion US dollars a year. The amount of money that's used globally to fight this is about 400 million. That's 0.13% of the profit. So we have huge profits and a tiny bit of money relative to the amount of problem. The other thing is the people like me globally who do this is about 40,000 people. It's estimated there's about 500,000 greed incentivized criminals. We have to follow rules and regulations and progress reports and funding requests and so forth. They can mutate and change and hurt somebody or do whatever it is they can if somebody gets close to them. And lastly, awareness associated with this is very low. Very few people know about the issue of human trafficking. They've heard bits and pieces, seen articles, but they haven't been able to develop in their mind exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about human trafficking.
So one thing that you wrote about in the book that really, it really struck me, and it really struck you when that happened to you, was that a student came up to you and said, "Hey, my iPhone will become more expensive if we tackle human trafficking." So what does this say about the kind of apathy that exists in the larger population when it comes to human trafficking?
Well, let me tell a little bit about the story in more detail.
Yeah.
So I did a presentation to a bunch of students at an international school, and I asked if anyone had any questions, and I answered them, and then I had to end. And as I was leaving, this young woman came up and said, "Well, I have one question. I wanted to ask the question, but I didn't have time. What happens if you solve human trafficking? Won't my iPhone become more expensive? And I ask her questions like, didn't you hear what I said? That like these people are tremendously suffering and horrible things happen. I mean, you're concerned about your iPhone. And she says, well, I don't have a lot of money. I'm, 14 years old. And, I'm just afraid that things are going to get more expensive. So said to myself, wow, I'm glad that question wasn't asked in front of all those other people.
Yeah.
They would have really just kind of laughed or said something. But then I went and I did a presentation in another school and somebody raised their hand and asked the same question. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible for this student. But as I started to answer, everybody's leaning forward to kind of see what my answer was going to be. And at that moment, I came to realize, wow, people really don't get what I'm talking about, because if they are so selfish as to feel like it has to be about them and having the prices be down, then we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And in your book, one of the most shocking things that I read was that men in South Asia largely believed that diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea can be cured by having sex with a young girl, and it may even rejuvenate their virility. Tell our audience more about this.
Okay, so in a lot of brothel areas, you have the main brothel where you have women and girls that are probably from around 16 to 30, depending upon the location. But also in some, you have children. And these children could be anywhere from 5 years old to 11 years old, 12 years old. They're not developed. They don't have, they're prepubescent. They don't have a body that's this, but there's this kind of sense that if you have sex with a child, you can't get a sexually transmitted disease. Now, if she's had sex multiple times, in fact, the vulnerability of you getting that disease is even higher. The second thing is there's this myth that if you have sex with somebody who has a sexually transmitted infection, that it eliminates it. Now, what that means is the man is going to have sex with a child and she's going to get that disease. Obviously, that's a myth. The third one is if you have sex with a child, it rejuvenates you. It's kind of like something about her youthful spirit will transfer over to you. All of these things are blatantly, horribly, unreal, and result in children being used by certain people for the purpose of achieving these myths in their mind.
Yeah. So in the myriad of horrid stories that are mentioned in your book, there was one very heartwarming tale. It was the story of Ravi in New Delhi, who rescued a sex worker from a red light area. But as they were escaping that brothel, they were caught, and Ravi helped the sex worker run away, but he was shivved. As far as we know, we don't know what happened to Ravi after it. So that's one story that was quite heartwarming, and I want you to recount it for our audience.
Yeah, I mean, what we had is a situation where a teenage group of boys, including Ravi, and I think that they were just starting college, went off to a brothel area. And he wasn't the type of person that would ever do this, but some of his classmates said, you got to come with me and so forth. So when he got there, his two classmates, found young girls or women, and they went off. Finally, there was a particular girl, and he said, well, you go with me. And they got into the room, and she started to say, okay, what do you want? And he said, well, I don't really want to do anything at all. I'll pay you. I don't have any interest in this. And so they just started talking. They had a conversation. After that, I think it was about a week later, he came back, and he wanted to purchase her time again. And she was like, oh, now he's turning out to be one of these other guys. But when he got in there, all he wanted to do was talk. So he kind of, over a period of time, fell in love with her. He didn't care that she was a woman and prostitute. She understood the situation. He could have a conversation. They never had sex. They never kissed. They never anything else. But he was very respectful to her. And so one day he went and he said, I want to buy you out of here. I got money and I'm going to go to the madam and so forth. And so she tried to stop him because that was going to get her in trouble. But he went anyways. And then he was kind of kicked out of the brothel, and she didn't think she'd ever see him again. And then what happened is one day he just showed up very late at night or early in the morning and said, oh, we need to get out of here. So he tried to get her to escape. And as they were escaping, one of the gundas, basically pimps, saw what was happening, ran after. They had a fight. He grabbed the girl. The boy, Ravi, basically was able to free them, and she was able to run away, but she didn't know what happened to her boyfriend. And then a while later, when she was at a shelter, somebody else from that same brothel said, well, he was stabbed, and she didn't know what happened to him. So we don't know what the end of the story is, but young men fall in love with women in these circumstances. And the same thing happens with the women themselves. They're trapped. They can't get out of the situation, but it's a common occurrence. The brothels don't want that to happen. It's bad for business. They want this to be something that's transactional and somebody just pays and they get the service and so forth. And so this was one of the stories that I heard that was very sad. There was another story where like the woman ran away and the pimp chased her and then grabbed her and started to beat her. And then like a bunch of people were standing around and he said, I'm the husband. And so in this particular case in Bangladesh, you don't do anything about it if it's the husband beating the wife. And so she said, no, he's not my husband. He's forcing me to a brothel and so forth. And then one guy stepped up and then he pushed him away. And then another. And what happened is you had a wall of people that were basically between her and this guy. He eventually lost interest, walked away, and then she was taken off to a shelter. But it demonstrates the compassion that exists within cultures where people see an injustice happening right in front of them.
Yeah. And these are nuggets that really come out in your book, that it's, these small gestures of kindness can actually make a big difference to the lives of those who have been trafficked. And so there was another thing. So there's a fascination in Indian travelers, especially when they travel to Thailand, about sex workers there. And a lot of people do end up buying sex because they think it's a very normal thing to do. Can you tell us how someone might actually be contributing to the industry of trafficking by buying sex in Thailand?
Well, one of the stories that I talked about was from a guy who would regularly go to Thailand and buy sex. And one of his friends' wives or girlfriends, I don't remember, basically said, well, you're supporting sex trafficking. And he says, no way. When I go there, these girls are all friendly and they laugh and smile and we giggle and we drink together. They can leave anytime they want. How could they possibly be sex trafficking victims? And I explained to him, well, many of them get tricked and deceived into a situation where they have to sell sex, but they have to meet a particular quota. And if they don't meet that quota, something bad happens to them. They could be beaten, food could be taken away, any number of things that can occur. So they very quickly come to realize that they have to be actresses. They have to pretend that they're happy. Then he says, well, they're right out in the open. They can run away anytime. Well, these traffickers basically will say, well, I know where your family is. If you try to leave, something bad will happen to them. And so there's this sense that like all of these people are just, these women are just oversexed women that want sex, and they fall in love with these people because they're so handsome. And at the end of the day, they do it because they have to. And if they can't achieve a certain quota, then they're going to be punished. And so I told this story to this guy, and I said to him, well, now that you know that you could be supporting sex trafficking, what are you going to do? And he basically said, well, I feel bad now because I want to still do it. He didn't have any compassion. Now, I've told that story to other people, and they've had other reactions. It's different for every person. Yeah. We did a film in Bangladesh on the topic of sex trafficking. And afterwards, I had a lot of men come and say, well, I wish you hadn't showed me that film. It ruined me forever going back there again because I had no idea there was that exploitation. But helping people to understand the implications of what happens when they sleep with these prostitutes and so forth is really important.
Right. Another emerging problem in trafficking, global trafficking, is cyber slavery, especially in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, other countries. You mention it briefly in your book, but it is perhaps the biggest destination for trafficking right now. Can you tell us briefly about the cyber slaves of Cambodia, how that trafficking can be prevented, if at all? And India is also a big victim of both trafficking as well as scams orchestrated from there. So it's very important for our readers to understand that kind of industry that has taken root in Cambodia.
Okay, so let me start how this all happened. This is a new phenomenon. It's only been within the last 5 years. during the time when COVID took place in Cambodia, you had a lot of these illegal gambling type places, and they had a lot of infrastructure. All of a sudden, COVID hit, and then nobody was coming to Cambodia to participate in this gambling. And so they had this infrastructure, but no money was coming in. And so some of these criminals came to realize that if you start trying to ask people for money, every 10th person you ask will give you some kind of money. And so said, okay, let's set up a scam situation. And so they started to go to Asians to say, why don't you come and join us? You can make a bunch of money. And a lot of Asian people said, well, we don't want to scam other Asians. We don't want to do that. So they said, okay, we'll get them to Cambodia and then we'll convince them to do it. So they started putting ads in the paper all across Southeast Asia, basically saying, if you are looking for a job to make $5,000 a month and you want a great experience, you're going to have a lot of fun, come to Cambodia and you can work in a casino, or you can work as an accountant, or you can work in the restaurant or whatever. So a lot of people, over 200,000 of young people started going to Cambodia. And when they got there, they were basically put in a van and then driven to a scam center. Now, a scam center is like a prison. It has high walls, barbed wire. And the moment you're there, you have to do this scamming work for 14, 15 hours a day. If you don't, you get beaten, you get tortured, terrible things happen to you. Sometimes they beat you to death. Sometimes if you can't do the work, they sell you back to their family. But the estimated number now, according to the United Nations, is about 225,000. So you see these scam centers in Cambodia and in Myanmar and Laos. But what happened is the countries in Southeast Asia put so much pressure on Cambodia and Myanmar to stop this that they stopped recruiting from Southeast Asia and they started to recruit from Bangladesh, Nepal, and India, because there wasn't as much pushback from the governments there. They were also getting people from Ghana and Kenya and Ethiopia, because these are English-speaking countries. So you have these scam facilities. They're large compounds. There's literally tens of thousands of people in there. There's a lot of Indian people who have been tricked and deceived into it. You can read the newspapers and see the raids and people coming back and so forth. How you prevent it is that if you think that there's a job overseas and they're immediately going to take you and they're going to immediately pay you a lot of money and it seems so easy, chances are you're setting yourself up for some kind of a bad circumstance. You have to really make sure, if you're going to take a migratory process, that the end point doesn't result in this type of scamming.
Yeah, so actually standees have come up at immigration in New Delhi, discouraging people from going to Cambodia if they're going there for a job. So it is one of the most urgent issues when it comes to global trafficking in India right now, something that the government is dealing with. Now, when we are working in harsh environments, it's easy to spiral into depression. That is also something that you mention in your book. And it is a question that we as journalists are also repeatedly asked, that how do you keep your sanity while you're working in these, writing these stories, interviewing people who've gone through so much trauma? I want to ask you today, how do you deal with this? How does one keep going when everything seems so dystopic?
Well, I didn't pick this cause. This cause picked me. There's something about it that drew me toward it. And once I heard about it, I couldn't turn it off. And so if you're an activist and you don't have any boundaries, then eventually all of the pain and suffering of the people that you come in contact eventually begins to build up inside of you. And 3 or 4 times I went into deep depression. I just decided that I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to participate in this. It's too difficult. But each time I would wait a couple of weeks and then I'd start seeing articles again and people would start calling me and then I started doing it. But I almost needed that depressed period to get to a point where I went to a low point and then I regenerated myself. It's almost like going from a caterpillar to a butterfly. So when I reemerged, I had more defense mechanisms. My personality had helped to develop things that would allow me to protect myself. And so, the thing about human trafficking is that we know that out of 50 million people, we're helping less than 1%. And so for us to feel like we're doing something, we focus on the starfish parable. Do you know what that is?
No, can you explain?
Okay, so a father and son are walking along a beach. It's 10 kilometers long, and Every few feet, the father sees a starfish that's been beached. So he picks it up and throws it in the water, walks a little bit more, picks it up, throws it. After about a kilometer, the son says, well, what are you doing? Why are you throwing all of these starfish in the water? This is a 10-kilometer beach. You can't possibly help them. What difference does it make? Well, the father says to the son, well, to every starfish that makes it back into the water, it makes all the difference in the world. So as activists, we have to take every person that we prevent from getting into human trafficking, every person we help, every person we get a job after their experience, and we celebrate that. And we feel like we're doing something good, because if we don't have that to encourage us to move forward, then this heaviness eventually will just shut us down.
So basically keeping our focus on what we can do instead of focusing on what we can't do.
Exactly. And just accepting the fact that you can't save the whole world. There are many amazing activists in India, some of the most benevolent, caring, compassionate, empathetic people I met. But part of the problem is they have too much compassion, too much empathy. And as a result of that, they like me, they can't turn it off. And that's a recipe for burnout.
So now, since it's a memoir, it's basically divided into two parts. First is the narratives of victims, and in the second part, you delve deep into what are some of the experiences that shaped you to become the person that you did eventually become, the person who's sitting in front of me right now from Hong Kong. So one of the most interesting things, although it's not related to human trafficking, is that you mentioned that you've been bitten by over 100 snakes and you've had snakes as pets. And I want you to do some PR for snakes now. People are really scared of them. And also, by any chance, I just wondered if you got a chance to ever work against animal trafficking as well, since you seem to have an affection for them.
Yeah, I mean, ever since I was a kid, 5 years old, if I saw a little snake, I'd go and pick it up. And oftentimes when you're picking up a small snake and you're a child, you get bit. And so it just pricks you. It doesn't do anything. And, I'd pick it up and play with it and let it go and then do another one. And so I probably picked up 400 or 500 snakes in my lifetime, a lot of them wild, some of them poisonous. So for me, it was never an issue. For a lot of people, it's an inherent archetype of fear. When it comes to spiders and snakes and, death and dying, there are just certain things that are on the top of the list. Public speaking is another one. But, snakes is one of those things that is really problematic. In that section, I described that I had a couple of pet snakes in my basement and they got loose. Yeah. And one of them was a boa constrictor. It was 6 feet and we couldn't find it for 6 months. And I had 3 sisters. And so they weren't very happy that the basement had this snake that was loose down there. The thing about snakes is they can go a year without eating. So it could have easily have just stayed there for longer. One day I just saw it and I put it back in the cage and so forth. But, the thing about fears is if you have a fear of snakes, one of the most empowering thing you can do is eventually get over it. So initially just look at pictures, then get to a room. There's a snake 12 feet away and then 5 feet away and then touch the tail and then hold it. And then eventually you won't have that fear. My biggest fear in life for a long time was public speaking. And, I had an experience that happened when I was young. And for years, I couldn't do public speaking. And one day I just said, I have to get over it. I just have to do it. And so I kept doing public speaking. Eventually, once I was over it, I eventually got awards and everything else as a result of it. So if we overcome our fear, sometimes, amazing things can happen. There was another part of your question. I don't think I answered it.
Did you ever work against trafficking of animals?
Wildlife trafficking. Yeah, I worked for an organization called Freeland in Thailand for a couple of years. They did, anti-wildlife trafficking, rhino horn and bear paws and bear bile and so forth. And so I helped out with some of their activities during the time that I was working on human trafficking.
Wow. So you also mentioned in your book, without naming the country or region, that you were present at a scene where tension built up and it finally resulted into riots. So I want to understand the kind of tension you witnessed before it all sort of crumbled into anarchy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll mention one of them. I was in Nepal. There was a health camp and it was set up by the government, and they had it for something like 12 days. That was the expectation. But a day early, they decided they were going to close it down. So you had all these people in line, and people had come from distances and so forth. So 5 minutes before the riot, everyone is in line, everybody's civilized, everyone's doing things. 5 minutes after the announcement that this was being closed, all of a sudden there was complete anarchy, and people just started kind of freaking out and running and grabbing things, and they pushed cars over and they started burning things, and the reason why I describe that story, because you see civilization moving in a particular direction, and then something happens that allows for people not to be civilized. I've seen it in the United States as well. It's not just, it's all over the world that we see this type of thing. And just to give an example, if there's a situation where all of a sudden there's a natural disaster and then there's no food, people change very quickly. They become very selfish. They'll do anything to get the food. They lose their kind of sense of civilization very quickly. And so I recognize when you stop and see various events around the world, how fragile our civilization is. And that's why I wrote that particular section.
So you are the CEO of Hong Kong-based Mekong Club right now. Tell us about the Mekong Club and how are you mobilizing the private sector to fight modern slavery?
So we're an organization that works with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way. So we have an association that includes banks, retailers, manufacturers, the hospitality sector. And what we do is we work with these businesses to help them to understand that within their supply chains or within their business, there's the vulnerability of modern slavery or human trafficking. Hotels have to be concerned about sex trafficking. Banks have to be concerned. Profits generated from human traffickers, if it gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering, they could be fined. And then, manufacturers and retailers have the potential for supply chains that have sweatshops. So we work with them, we educate them, we help them to identify the vulnerability, and then we help to fix that. And if they run into a problem, we work with them to help solve the issue. And that allows us to be able to contribute by using a group that is incentivized to address this. The private sector realizes that if they are on the front page of a newspaper as exploiting people, it has a devastating impact on their business. So many of these big companies will do anything and everything they can to ensure that there's no exploitation in their business. A lot of people don't understand that about businesses. There's a lot of great businesses who really do care, not all of them. But we work with the ones that really want to make a difference and ensure that there's no vulnerability.
So I want to ask, the last question that I want to ask you is that, we've mentioned how systemically fighting trafficking is extremely difficult. We've made extremely small gains, if at all. So in personal capacity, how can one help? Are there any identifiers? For example, if I'm walking on the road, and in India, you see a lot of children also on the road. Are there any signs to identify at railway stations, on the roads, bus stops, to identify victims of trafficking, and how can one help them?
Okay, I'm going to tell a story first, and then I'll answer that question. So years ago, I decided I was going to write this book. It was another book. It's called Captive Daughters. I never published it, but that's what gave me all these interviews. And as part of that process, I went from shelter to interview the women and the girls who had been trafficked. I went to one shelter, and there was a girl named Gita. And every time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to give my story. But she sat and listened to all of my interviews. When I had finished there and I was leaving, Gita comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You can have my story. So she sat on one side of the table, the rest of us on the other side of the table. And over a 3-hour period, she just told the worst story I had ever heard of rape and torture and disease. I was so shocked I didn't know what to say. So finally, I turned to Gita and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrible things they did to you. She paused and paused. Then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? Said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. Said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that all of these places were right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they are just bad people doing what bad people do, bad things. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for allowing a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times. She had AIDS, she was dying. And so Gita pretty much called us all out. So I do a lot of presentations, and at the end of the presentations, I say to my audience, if I could get each of you to do just one thing, that's 1 times 100. Or if we do get in front of 1 million people, 1 times 1 million, that adds up. So one of the things you can do is learn about the issue. Once you know that, you can talk to your friends and family and coworkers and so forth. Another thing you can do is to basically, if you're going to buy something, like a cell phone or something, then you go and look on the website whether they have a policy related to modern slavery, human trafficking. If they do, congratulate them. If they don't, you just say, I'd like your products and I'd feel comfortable if you have that. You can be a person who reports things that look as if they shouldn't be happening. Actually, if you're under the age of 12 and you're working in a construction site, that's child labor. And that's considered to be a form of human trafficking because the child doesn't have the agency or the ability to basically make those types of decisions. You can volunteer. There's a lot of organizations that need volunteers. My youngest volunteer was 9 years old. She saw me in a documentary and said, Mr. Friedman, I want to help. I said to her, you're 9 years old. She said, so what? I said, you're 9 years old. She said, 9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Let me do something. So I asked her what she could do. She said she could find anything on the internet. So I had a couple of, Ivy League second-year law students, and they couldn't find stuff. I gave it to her. 2 days later, I had everything I need. Because we as human beings all have, an inherent gift. It could be public speaking, it could be writing, it could be networking, selling t-shirts, it doesn't matter. You apply that to volunteerism, it makes a big deal. Another thing is just raising money and donating it to organizations or fundraising. A lot of organizations are suffering now. So as human beings, if we could get people to understand the issue and then start stepping up and doing something, even if it's something small, that would add up to something very big over time as well.
So we leave you on a rather somber but hopeful note. And when it comes to learning about human trafficking, this is a great book right here. Congratulations on this book, Mr. Friedman, and thank you for doing all the good work that you do. And I hope that you continue to do it, even in the face of how global politics is shifting and what we discussed earlier in the interview about US aid. Thank you for joining The Print. This is Shubhangi Mishra, and thank you for watching our soft cover.
Thank you very much.